Too often, we enjoy the comfort of opinion without the discomfort of thought. John F. Kennedy. Most people think that they're good at handling problems. And to be fair, most people probably are, when the problem is easy, calm, and logical. And more importantly, when it's separated from emotion, either ours or theirs. But that's not usually how problems show up. Usually, they show up attached to frustration, attached to stress, sometimes attached to attitude. Say a coworker comes into your office, irritated, and they're short with you. Your spouse brings something up with a tone that you don't like, or a friend sounds defensive before the conversation even starts. Now consider this. It's you who comes across to them the same way. But regardless of who it is, what's interesting is how fast our mind stops hearing the issue and starts reacting to the person. You stop listening for information and you start judging the delivery. You're having that conversation in your mind while they're talking, saying things to yourself like, "You could have said that better. Why are you coming at me like this? You're always negative. You're difficult." And yes, maybe they are. But that still doesn't answer the question of whether the complaint itself is real. And this is where relationships break down, both personally and professionally. Because we feel like we need their frustration packaged and presented in a way that we like it before we'll hear it. But most people aren't that polished when it's something that actually matters to them. And we compound it by instinctively taking what is being said, not as information, not as something to review, but as a threat or an attack on us. And the thing is, most of us realize how quickly defensiveness takes over a conversation. That internal shift where you stop trying to understand and start trying to protect yourself. And it happens fast. Somebody says, "Hey, you've been distant lately." And instead of hearing the concern, your brain is your attorney, and it immediately starts building your defense. "I've been busy. I'm doing the best I can. Don't you see everything I'm carrying?" Or at work, somebody questions a decision you made. And before they've even finished explaining themselves, you're already mentally preparing your response instead of listening to theirs. That reaction is human. However, some of us, when our defenses are activated, we immediately hand over our emotional control. While others, when they notice it happening, they slow themselves down and ask, "Why did that hit me so fast?" And that's usually where the useful part of the conversation starts. Because sometimes the reason you reacted so strongly has nothing to do with any disrespect. Sometimes you're exhausted. Sometimes it's an insecurity. And sometimes it's because deep down, you already know the criticism isn't completely wrong. And that's when it gets uncomfortable. And without realizing it, we create bigger problems. Because we treat that discomfort as our validation that the other person is attacking us. But discomfort isn't proof of unfairness. Sometimes it's just friction between how we see ourselves and how we're being experienced by other people. On the other hand, some people communicate poorly. Sometimes the other person is projecting their own frustrations. But if every difficult conversation immediately becomes a courtroom where you feel the need to defend your feelings, eventually people are going to stop talking to you. Think about how often people reject information because they don't like the packaging it arrived in. And it's easy to understand why. Delivery matters. Tone of voice matters. The timing matters. There's a right and a wrong way to approach people. And emotional intelligence doesn't mean pretending those things don't exist. But we compound the situation when we make perfect delivery the requirement for being heard. Because, unfortunately, real life usually isn't always that clean. Most of us don't communicate at our best when we're frustrated, overwhelmed, disappointed, hurt. We stumble through it, often very poorly. We say too much or not enough. Sometimes we sound irritated when we're just tired. Sometimes we sound angry when we're actually feeling dismissed. But we're all guilty of doing this. We merge the complaint and the person into one thing. So now the issue itself gets ignored because the delivery created emotional static. Think about any relationship you've been in. One of you says, "I feel like you haven't been present lately." And instead of looking at whether there's truth inside the statement, the conversation immediately becomes about how they said it, or more importantly, justifying how we've been present. Now, sometimes bad delivery is a legitimate issue, whereas other times, complaining about the delivery is an escape hatch. It's a way of avoiding dealing with something uncomfortable. However, mature communication requires the ability to separate the two lanes. You can correct someone's delivery and still take in the issue. You can dislike the tone and still recognize their concern underneath it. And to be honest, some of the most important feedback we ever receive arrives imperfectly. Because as humans, we can be imperfect communicators, especially when we're under pressure. On the other hand, one of the most significant forms of resentment that people carry is that feeling that they weren't actually heard. Most of us can handle disagreement. Most of us can even handle being corrected. But what wears many of us down is where we feel like an entire conversation gets reduced to our attitude or our emotional state, instead of the thing that we were actually just trying to say. And after a while, people adjust to that. They'll simply stop bringing things up. Not because the issue went away, but because they've learned the conversation will probably turn into judgment of them before the examination of the issue. That's where distance starts forming in relationships and at work. And to be fair, sometimes the listener genuinely believes they handled the conversation well. They stayed calm. They didn't yell. They pointed out the person's tone or attitude and explained why it wasn't productive. But calmness alone doesn't guarantee understanding. A conversation can stay completely civil while still making one of the parties feel dismissed. And this is why unresolved tension has a way of compounding. Because once we feel unheard enough times, we usually stop communicating directly and start communicating indirectly. Our patience is shorter. There's more sarcasm, and there's definitely reduced effort. So where the original issue may have been small, now the resentment is about feeling like they're not taken seriously when something matters to them. And again, this doesn't mean every emotional reaction deserves validation or agreement. It doesn't mean every complaint is warranted. But when people consistently feel like they have to sanitize their frustration before they can be taken seriously, eventually it's just easier to stop trying altogether. Here's something else. Many of us confuse emotional control with emotional absence. Like it means becoming completely unaffected, completely detached, remaining calm all the time, being logical all the time, letting nothing get under your skin. But that's not how people work. Emotion is information. Granted, not always accurate or complete information, but information nonetheless. Frustration can point to repeated disappointment. Withdrawal can point to having grown tired. Irritation can point to feeling overlooked. And anxiety can point to uncertainty that hasn't been addressed. But where we get ourselves in trouble is when we treat the emotion as the problem instead of asking what it might be attached to. You can see this happen a lot in professional situations. A manager notices morale dropping or tension increasing. Maybe communications becoming less polite. But instead of asking what might be building underneath the behavior, they just label the team as problematic because that explanation is simple and more convenient. But it's also a way of immediately shutting down the opportunity for finding a solution. Personally, we do the same thing Someone close to us starts being more distant or more impatient, and instead of wondering what might be weighing on them, our first instinct is judgment of them. Why are they acting like this? Instead of what's making them act like this. Remember, if you only focus on behavior without trying to understand what's fueling it, you'll often end up treating symptoms while the actual problem keeps growing underneath. However, one of the hardest parts of all this is realizing that sometimes the biggest obstacle in a difficult conversation isn't the other person's attitude. It's our ego. Because once a complaint feels personal, objectivity gets really difficult. If somebody questions your consistency, your leadership, your communication, your effort, your attention, it can feel like they're questioning you as a person. And when that happens, most of us instinctively protect ourselves before we evaluate the person in the mirror. Again, that's simply being human, but it creates a problem. The conversation will likely shift from, is there something here worth looking at, to, how do I prove I'm not the type of person they're describing? Moreover, when we tie our identity too tightly to being competent, self-aware, or emotionally intelligent, we often struggle with criticism in those exact areas, because that feedback can be in direct competition with how we see ourselves. And when identity gets involved, people start reaching for explanations fast. But they can also become shields that prevent honest reflection. So you can care about people and still neglect them. You can mean well and still communicate poorly. You can work hard and still create frustration around you. We're all complicated that way. But self-leadership requires the ability to be in that tension without immediately deferring to self-protection. It's being able to consider the possibility that somebody's experience with you may contain information you haven't fully seen yet. One of the clearest signs of maturity is the ability to stay connected to reality when your emotions are trying to pull you somewhere else. It doesn't mean you're pretending you're unaffected, but you're just resisting the urge to immediately protect yourself long enough to see what's actually in front of you. Because sometimes the conversation isn't really about the complaint at all. Sometimes it's about whether people feel safe bringing difficult things to you in the first place. That matters more than we realize. The people around you are constantly learning what happens when they tell you something uncomfortable. They learn whether you get curious or defensive, whether you listen or explain, and whether every hard conversation turns into a discussion about your intentions instead of their experience. And then over time, people adjust. Some might keep coming to you. Some might become more guarded. And some might stop talking to you altogether. There's value in noticing how often the hardest conversations in your life aren't ruined by the problem itself. They're ruined by what happens after discomfort enters the discussion. And sometimes, the difference between growth and distance is simply whether you make them feel heard before they feel judged. As always, thanks for spending a few minutes with me. Until next time, stay sharp, stay grounded, and keep showing up.